manufacturing base in the US. I know I brought it up last time because one of my guests was talking about intentional efforts to bring down the value of the US dollar, to bring with the manufacturing base to the US. You quickly shat on this idea and you don't believe that's the case. And you also said how they cannot achieve it even if they wanted to. They cannot bring the value of the dollar down because of the euro dollar. The dollar is available outside. Right. The country is kind of gotten out of control in a way. And your friend George Gammon talks about the network effect as well that cannot be reversed. If you ask people to stop buying gold, they're going to buy more gold, if you know what I mean. So if you tell people to stop using the dollar. Now, the reason, what do you make of the narrative that the collapse of the manufacturing base in the US is existential for the American empire? And I want you to plug this into the whole discussion, the Ray Dalio discussion about the end of the American empire being overstretched. Do you think that is going on?
Well, from a political sense. Yeah. So from the political sense, you think about, okay, I know that people make the comparison. If we ever get into a shooting war with China, China has, an industrial base that's sort of like what the US was before World War II. And therefore we're screwed, right? Because China has the ability to manufacture all sorts of stuff and we don't have the ability to manufacture. And so from a political perspective, it's certainly from a military perspective, it seems like suicide. Because we don't have the industrial base anymore to support a actual wartime economy. Yeah, we can fight these limited wars here and there, what are called limited wars here and there, but an actual true war of survival against China, that would be absolute suicide because they have the industrial base. But that's not the only consideration. From a macroeconomic perspective, losing the industrial base was difficult, but it wasn't an existential problem. Again, I say this from somebody who grew up in the Rust Belt, especially during the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s. So I saw the area that I grew up in be hollowed out by globalization. And it wasn't fun. I mean, people who had decent middle-class jobs, friends, parents, friends, families, they had middle-class jobs, and suddenly their parents were thrown out of work and they had to move away and do God knows what on someplace else across the country. So as hard as that was being deindustrialized from a macroeconomic perspective, it actually wasn't existential. It wasn't fatal. I don't think it was necessarily good because it left the economy in a poorer shape. However, there are different ways to get around that. If we had gone through a longer upswing from the Eurodollar cycle if we didn't have a 2008 crisis in 2008, I think the U.S. would have been able to adjust better to the deindustrialization in the 2000s was the big one. Whatever you think about Ross Perot, his giant sucking sound, he was right. He just got the timing wrong and the target wrong. He thought it was going to be Mexico, but it ended up being China. He thought it was going to be Mexico in the 1990s.
What did he say? What did he say?
He said after NAFTA was signed in the early 1990s, it was the 96 election. He called it a giant sucking sound. He said after NAFTA was signed, you're going to hear this giant sucking sound as American jobs were sucked down to Mexico. So he got the sucking sound correct. He got the timing and the target wrong. And that actually happened in the 2000s after the dot-com recession.
Interesting. So he said a lot of the manufacturing base from the U.S. will be sucked into Mexico, but he mentioned an earlier timescale that actually happened. It happened a bit later than what he said, and it went to China, obviously not Mexico.
It went, if you look at it, manufacturing jobs in the U.S., and you pull it up on the BLS website or go to St. Louis Fed's site, just type in manufacturing jobs. What happens is, manufacturing jobs plateaued in the 70s. And they were flat through the 1980s and early 1990s. And when Ross Perot said giant sucking sound, they continued to be flat throughout the 1990s. It wasn't until after the dot-com recession in 2001, during that what was otherwise a mild recession, manufacturing jobs plummeted and they never came back. In fact, they fell for year after year after year, which led to the jobless recovery. So manufacturing jobs.
Why did we give it up? What happened?
Some of it was China. China joining the WTO, which really opened up the Chinese to become the manufacturer to the world. You had the ample liquidity through the Eurodollar system was only itching to do something with all that money. So we're going to build factories in China, grease the wheels of trade to move stuff here, create supply chains that are, scattered throughout the rest of the world. The 2000s was sort of like the perfect storm of deindustrialization of the U.S. So again, Ross Perot was right, had the wrong target and the wrong mix, but on the wrong timing, but that was effectively what happened. In the middle 2000s, you saw manufacturing really take a hit, and then it took another hit in 2008 for obvious reasons, and it just never came back. So it's been ever since the early part of the 21st century, manufacturing really got hollowed out in the U.S., and there really is no way to go back to it.
Okay, that was my next question. There's no way to go back to it, even with the technological advancements with AI and robotics?
that's sort of the possibility and the hope. But even there, if you can train an American worker to use AI, why can't you train a Mexican worker to use AI much cheaper?
But then the value of the worker becomes less and less important. So it's not about how many workers you have; it's about the capabilities of your AI. And it goes back to energy. And this is a battle for energy. Who has more energy will have the manufacturing base, because a lot of it will be dependent on energy and AI, which uses.
Well, it's not energy so much as it is productivity, and productivity takes into account a total factor. Productivity takes into account all of those inputs. So if Mexico has cheaper workers but far more expensive and unreliable energy and power, then that certainly gives the advantage back to other workers who are not in Mexico. But I don't think that's necessarily the case. And then there's still the huge disadvantage of wages, where people in Mexico, and really outside of Mexico, now you're seeing, Vietnam. Vietnam is the next China. Not necessarily India, it's Vietnam. India is more of a high value, multifaceted economic growth story, whereas Vietnam is like literally the new China, where all the factories that used to be in China at the end of the supply chain are being removed into Vietnam. So Vietnam has a tremendous labor advantage over basically anyone around the world outside of Southeast Asia. Plus, Vietnam is developed enough where it can become a reliable, robust manufacturing center and manufacturing hub. And also, they're pretty friendly with everybody else, unlike the Chinese. So Vietnam has tremendous built-in advantages where even if we have better power supply and reliability here in the U.S., they still have a tremendous labor wage advantage, which means productivity it probably favors Vietnam over the U.S. So it would be really difficult to get labor, to get manufacturing, low-skill labor back into the U.S.